Welcome, everybody, to another Consciousness Cafe event. This evening, we have as a special guest, Mark Hunter Brooks, one of the founding members here of Consciousness Cafe. And this evening's discussion is entitled A Framework for Spiritual Understanding. Mark is the author of the book Earth's Hidden Reality and has had numerous spiritual experiences since 2003 that have profoundly changed his worldview. Today, he writes and speaks about the mechanics of the non-physical world, helping make what many consider to be mystical easier to understand. Professionally, Mark Brooks managed multiple IT and business projects for a Manhattan-based Fortune 100 financial service firm, and he has an MBA from New York University. So please join me in welcoming Mark Hunter Brooks.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everybody. This is going to be an interesting presentation tonight. Normally, we do conversations back and forth, and later on, Daniel and I are going to have a conversation about what I've presented. But I really have this, I don't know if you want to call it a burning desire or a passion, to help people understand why they believe what they believe. And that's really the crux of this, because especially with people from a religious background, they can quote chapter and verse of scripture for you. And I know many of you are not directly involved with a faith tradition, or not now. You may have been, but people go to worship services, seminars, conferences, and even people with no religion go to seminars, conferences, peak experiences, and they get little tidbits of information, but they don't know how it all integrates together. And that's the purpose of this conversation that we wanted to have tonight, is to give you a framework for understanding spiritual development, or what I'll call consciousness maturity. And that's the way I'll talk about it this evening. I'm going to start out with a short presentation of a framework that I developed when I was going through my spiritual development process, and I'm still on that road. That I wanted to share what I came up with you folks, so you would have a little bit more of an advantage, or be farther along down the road of finding a guide or developing your own guide to help you with your spiritual development process. As far as I know, there's no other model like this that's out there. I haven't found it. And there's one similar to this that Dr. K, who spoke at the Consciousness Cafe on February 7th, came up with. It was 12 steps to spiritual maturity. That's more from a spiritual basis. And you can find that on the Consciousness Cafe's YouTube site. But what I'm going to talk about this evening is going to be more of a bridge from faith traditions to spirituality for people that are older, that have that spiritual or faith tradition history that they don't know what to do with, to go from that to a truly or a fully spiritual understanding. Young people, they have a lot more spiritual abilities than older people do, so they are farther along down this path. They have less that they need to know about or understand from a belief standpoint, because they know it internally. And I'm hoping that we can have this conversation after we do this presentation of, once we have a model, we can talk about how it's changed or could be changed for people with different backgrounds or different understandings or different experiences. And I hope that you'll take this model that I've produced, and I'm going to put a link to it on the YouTube site once the YouTube video recording of this goes up online. So you'll be able to download the PDF of the 8 slides that I'll be presenting this this afternoon, so that you'll have that as well. But I encourage you to make it your own. And also, too, I hope that everybody's on a spiritual path, and that you're doing, something to feed and nourish that spiritual side of you. And I'm sure everyone on this call is. I hope that people you know and your friends that you talk to them about the spiritual side of life as well. So just a couple administrative things before we get into the presentation. If you have questions or comments as I go through the presentation, put it in the chat. Daniel's going to be monitoring the chat, and he'll use that to stimulate the conversation that we have afterwards. But I'm going to go through this pretty fast. There's a lot of information. If you have questions about the model that I've present, you can ask it at the end. But put messages in the chat while I'm speaking, while Daniel and I are talking. And then when we get to the Q&A period, if you will raise your hand and be recognized, if you go down to the reactions in the little menu at the bottom of the Zoom page, you'll be able to raise your hand and we'll recognize you there. So with that, let me share my screen and we'll get started. Now you may see me looking off to the side, so my apologies that I'm sharing the screen so you won't see my face, but for people who are seeing my face on this gallery view, I'm going to be looking at another screen to talk.
Can you make that bigger, Mark?
Yes, I am. I am right now. The best analogy that I have for people who are following a spiritual path but don't know what it's like or what to do with it, they don't have a direction. The best analogy that I heard was someone who said it's like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle without having a picture of what it looks like. And you get all these little individual pieces and tidbits of information. And sometimes when things fit together or it meshes with something you already understand, you get real excited. But you don't have any overall overarching picture of what that process is like. And that's what I wanted to talk about with this framework that we'll discuss this evening. It has 2 steps. And the first is to create a scale that you can measure against. And then once you have a scale that you've identified, create a model for how to progress in that scale. And I want to recommend the map of consciousness that was developed by Dr. David Hawkins. He wrote a book called The Map of Consciousness Explained, and he includes this map of consciousness in it. I only list a couple columns. He has, I think, 5 columns in his map of consciousness, but I'm going to use that as the scale. And Dr. Hawkins used kinesiology. If you know kinesiology, it's where you hold your arm out and somebody else will move your arm down, and depending on if you may be allergic to some substance that you're holding against your chest, your arm will be weaker or stronger. Strong if you're not allergic to it, weak if you are. That's one way you can determine if you have sensitivities to some things. And there's other uses for kinesiology as well. But Dr. Hawkins used kinesiology to come up with this a logarithmic scale from 0 to 1,000. And he tested with a number of his psychiatric patients to give them an idea of where they fell in this map of consciousness at the different levels. And he said most of the people in the country are somewhere around 175, which is, he equated to being pride. But he said that the lower levels are more selfish, more self-oriented. And as you reach courage is the transition point between being more selfish and more self or others oriented. And you go on up the ladder from there. And when you reach the higher ends, enlightenment, he said, no one on earth, maybe some adepts, if you're familiar with adepts, maybe up at that level. But he said even like Jesus and the Buddha were like 600, maybe 700. So that's a real high level to reach. But a number of people who are very centered on reason, rationality, they're around the 400s. And people who are more in tune with love and what should I say, love, joy, and happiness. They're more at the 500 level, but most people are sitting here around 175. And you'll see a range of people, if you read his book, Dr. Hawkins's book, people who are in the range between 175 and 400. Now, for this conversation, I was only going to talk about 3 points, and that's this point of courage that I just mentioned, this differentiation between love and reason at the 400, 500 level, and something that happens when you're up in the enlightenment area that all relates to this map of consciousness or consciousness maturity, spiritual understanding, spiritual development. Now, I like to ask Christians, what is salvation? And I'm going to use this as an example, and my apologies for people who are of a different faith tradition or no faith. But it's something that's pretty common as people talk about salvation, but they don't really have an understanding of it, or they use doctrine or dogma to answer the question. And I want to use this as an example to kind of launch into this spiritual or consciousness maturity framework that I came up with, because it's something that a lot of people can understand and relate to. So some of the more common answers to, what is salvation or how do you become saved? They will say to believe in Jesus, to repent and be baptized, to become more like him, to pick up your cross and follow him, or to rejoice when you face trials. And I summarize those things as to believe, to change, to emulate, to have courage, and to grow. And if you look at it, that's different points on a continuum. So all these different answers, while they may seem separate, they're actually different points. Different points along a spiritual path. And that's what I wanted to share with you, because a lot of people from a faith tradition background don't really understand this answer. They think that that's the be all and end all to what your faith tradition is all about. But I want to say it's a progression that will take you really from the lower levels of this map of consciousness to 200. And that's what I want to show you next, is that actually salvation is one of 4 different ways you can come onto a spiritual path. Now, this is the model that I developed when I was going through my spiritual development work. So this is what I really wanted to share with you. And this is in my book, Earth's Hidden Reality. But I added salvation since I published the book. But I came up with experiences and questions, trials and tests, emotions and ego as having raw emotions or extreme emotions or strong ambition or ego that really grates on people, and having others tone you down to be more in line with society. Trials and tests you face all your life, and that may be job loss, it may be serious illness, it may be the death of a close friend. Experiences and questions are philosophical questions or spiritual or life experiences that you may have had that cause you to ask questions about your spirituality. And this is what brings you onto the spiritual path. And I talk about 3 different tracks that are going on simultaneously when you get on that path. Is a recognition of something greater than yourself, or the need to explore or find out about things spiritual that aren't generally talked about. Doing your reading, having a mentor who shares things with you about what you're studying, what you're trying to work through. And then once you develop that information, you lead a productive life, applying it. And this is all an intellectual understanding of spirituality or an intellectual understanding of faith, depending on how you came into this spiritual path. But while you're also doing this, you have a spiritual practice development, which I say is learning how to quiet your mind. And that's what is the most important thing you can do in your spiritual development, is quiet that chatter in your head. Because when you have a quiet mind, you can discern between conversation or your own thoughts and understandings, and then thoughts that are put in your mind from an external source, from a non-physical or spiritual source. And that's really key to having some of these spiritual experiences that you'll have later on in your spiritual development. But develop a quiet mind, learn how to manipulate energies within your body, or develop your intuitive skills if you feel more drawn to that, like with mediums or healers or energy workers. But develop a spiritual practice, and that also includes meditation and contemplation. And then third is develop a spiritual community. You want to develop a group of people who are more like you, who think more like you, because that's going to come into play as you reach this fourth point in your spiritual path, and that's journey inward. Now, I'm going to go on to another chart that talks about the stages of faith. This is actually from a book that's used in seminaries, as written by Janet Hagberg and Ray Gulich, called The Critical Journey. And I have a listing of the bibliographic information at the end of the presentation. But there's 6 stages of faith in this book, The Critical Journey. I just talked about 3 of them. It's recognition, or the acknowledgement of something else in your life that and a desire to better understand it. Doing the intellectual understanding of a faith tradition or spiritual tradition by studying history, tradition, scripture, and then applying what you've learned. But at some point, you're going to start having conflicts between your life experiences or your spiritual practice and what you intellectually understand. And this is going to cause you to question what you believe. And a lot of people, especially in faith traditions, they back away from this point. And I call that the wall. And that's what it's called in this book, The Critical Journey, as well, is it's a point where you really question what you believe because it doesn't agree with what you've experienced in your life.
Oh.
Yeah. And a lot of people will back away from it and not go there. And so they'll stay in this third stage, the productive life, but they'll never really get to a point to where they're going to develop a strong spirituality. And this is what the goal of the wall is to reconcile what you intellectually understand about spirituality or faith with your spiritual practice, with your life experiences. And this is where that spiritual community comes into play, is because those are the people that are going to keep you on that path, that are going to keep you from falling off the path or dropping away because you have so many questions you can't answer. Because you really need to stay with it. It may take you months, it may take you years to go through this, but once you get through it and you reconcile what you believe, you internalize that and you have an experientially based spirituality. And one of the things I wanted to say here is that, and this is important, is that every spirituality that you have or that people have is all unique. And you may have different faith traditions that want to put out cookie cutter beliefs of hundreds or thousands of people. And in a real spiritual development model or a consciousness maturity model, you don't have that. It's just as individual as our personalities are, because we have different life experiences that have led us to the point to where we integrate what that intellectual understanding is with our life experiences and spiritual practice. But as you do that and journey outward with this new idea of spirituality, you really come into more of a life of love that is not necessarily based on some written understanding, but it's based on an experiential understanding. Now, the spiritual path I put up here, and you'll see another block later on, is the map of consciousness scale levels 200 through 700. And what I talked about with salvation was 20 through 200. So we're talking about going from here to here with what churches or different faith traditions would talk about, salvation. And that's really the part where religion plays an important role. But as you go farther along in the spiritual path from 200 to 700, it becomes more and more individual. and your community becomes more and more important. And that's what I wanted to bring out at this point. For people that go way beyond to the end, to the levels 700 to 1,000 in the map of consciousness, I refer them to, or I would refer you to, Evelyn Underhill's book, Mysticism, which she wrote in the early 1900s. This is probably the seminal work on mysticism, and it has the broadest amount of information in it to tell you what mystics see, feel, and understand, the process for developing mystical orientations in life. Talks about monastics, yogis, what they've experienced, but it really is an incredible book. Part 2 of that book talks about the different stages on the mystical path, and I listed 5 of 8 here. The others are duplicated in that spiritual path that I talked about earlier. But the one I wanted to draw your attention to is the dark night of the soul, and you may have heard that if you have been participating in a faith tradition. And that's really at a point where your spiritual practice development has gone to the point to where you've gotten rid of your ego, you've gotten rid of your emotion, and even gotten rid of your thought. Later on in this mystical path, they'll say you want to control your thoughts. But if you eliminate ego, emotion, and thought, you get to a point to where you say, what reason is there for me to live? If you get rid of ego, emotion, and thought, you get rid of desire. And people get very depressed at this point. So that's why they said dark night of the soul. But the trick to passing through this point that I wanted to share with you is you need to change your worldview. And you'll be more able to do this as you progress in your spiritual development. But when you change your worldview from a more earthly worldview that we're human beings to a spiritual worldview that we're eternal spiritual beings, that gives you another reason for living, and it's more to be of service to other people, to selflessly love other people. And that's a big difference. And also to build goodwill for people who may have less than you or be needing things that you can supply or provide. That's what you do when you change your worldview from an earthly worldview to a spiritual worldview. It's at more acts of service, more building goodwill. And that's the difference that you make when you go through this point of the dark night of the soul. So I wanted to summarize that in this chart, and this is a little busy. These are those 3 points that I talked about at the start of the presentation. This point of courage, where you go from a more selfish, self-centered behavior to an other-centered behavior. That's a mind transformation. At level 400, this is about where you hit the wall, where you have multiple paths of understanding, a spiritual practice and intellectual understanding of spirituality, your spiritual community, but then also your life experiences. You reconcile and internalize those, which produces a single strong spirituality. And then at this dark night of the soul, at level 700 or above, you have a soul transformation from an earthly worldview to a more spiritual worldview. And this takes you from having actions based on fear, anger, or shame to actions that are based on a desire for selfless service to others. And that's really the core to this model. You take a scale and that you want to use as your measurement for your spiritual growth. You develop a model for how to get there. The model I shared with you is the model that I used using the map of consciousness as a scale. And this allows you to be more objective in your measurements or in your understanding of your spiritual growth. And you'll see here salvation, going to the spiritual path, going to the wall, going to the dark night of the soul. And the books that I used for doing that are these 5 here. Again, I'll put the PDF or a link to this PDF on the YouTube page when we do the upload to the Consciousness Cafe website. And that's it.
Well, that's quite a nutshell.
I know. It's like drinking from a fire hose. I apologize for people, to people for giving you so much information, but I wanted you to get that idea of the concept down.
So, what would you say the objective is for understanding what you've presented? The goal of this would be for the viewers.
Yeah, this gives us a baseline for a conversation about spirituality. You may have come up through a faith tradition. You may be a young person who has not had any spiritual training from a faith tradition, but have spiritual experiences or have spiritual abilities. You may not have any faith tradition background. You may have no belief there, but this guide will give you a way to talk about that and have a discussion and say, I'm more of this and less of that. But this would give us a framework to where we can have that discussion, because right now I think everything is nebulous or unformed.
Now,
And this is a way to be more concrete about it.
Thank you. And hence the term framework for spiritual development. Now, you've used a number of terms that are more common in Christianity, but this is not limited to Christianity. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct.
So, for example, the term disciple, you're just mainly saying, a dedicated student, it seems.
Correct. That's
Very
a good way to put it.
Mm-hmm. And another term that sticks out, salvation. Please say some more about what your definition and understanding of that term is, and maybe put up your diagrams again.
Yeah, let me do that, because different people have different understandings, and that's really what I wanted to try and create a standard there.
And I'll remind the folks, if you have a question or you want to put something into the chat, please do so, and we will have an audience Q&A after I'm done interrogating Mr. Brooks.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, Mark.
Well, it's really, if you ask someone who only has an intellectual understanding of faith, they're going to give you one of these answers down below. Believe in Jesus, be baptized, repent of your sins. They'll give you something like that. But I think if you're on a spiritual path, you'll realize that what Christians talk about as salvation is really just the initial parts or the on-ramp to a spiritual path. And I like to talk about Father Bruce Ritter in my book. He was a priest in the 1980s in Manhattan, and he was the founder of Covenant House, which was a place for homeless people, runaways under 21. And he had a lot of kids who were living out on the street, and he was trying to serve their needs. And he had volunteers that would make hot chocolate every day and make sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and take them around at night in their cars to kids who were out on the street. And his idea is that you had to take care of their physical needs, give them shelter, give them clothes, give them food, give them safety. You have to take care of their physical needs, their base needs, before you can talk to them about spiritual topics or spirituality. And I see salvation as being the same thing, is you have to take care of those basic needs. If someone has these very selfish desires or emotions or egotistical traits, you need to take them through a process that will get rid of that, to bring them to a point where they can get on the spiritual path. And that's what I think the concept of salvation is. It's talking about just doing the nuts and bolts, blocking and tackling, getting you to a point to where you can get on a spiritual path. But if you grew up with a faith tradition, you'll know and probably realize that you had a different background or different upbringing from someone who didn't, who may have been in areas that that aspect of life was not as prevalent. Let me put it that way. But I see salvation, just to summarize, as being the point to get you on the ramp, to give you the on ramp to your spiritual path. It's not the be all and end all of spirituality.
All right. So I would not apply the term salvation. And perhaps we've got some people making noise in the background there. Okay. We're going to ask everybody to be muted unless you have something to add to the conversation. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I would apply the term salvation there. It sounds a little bit more like awakening might be the current term. Would you agree?
There you go. That's another way to look at it. And I thank you for saying that, because I wanted to go back to what I said at the start, is I want people to take this and make it their own. I don't have any claim. Well, I do have a copyright claim on this, but it's really you take this and make it your own, because your life experiences are different from mine. Your spiritual experiences are different from mine. But I wanted to give you a baseline from which you can, or a prototype from which you can make changes and make it your own, because so many people don't have it. So yes, when you talk about awareness or an awakening, I think that's a good substitute for that.
Yeah, the term salvation has a finality to it, like you've been saved.
Yeah.
But really what you're saying is that you're on the path to understanding at deeper and deeper levels, it sounds like.
Right. You've just started on that path, rather than that's the whole path. That's my definition of it. Now, if I get into a conversation with people with a faith background, faith tradition background, they'll probably have something different to say, but that's okay. And also too, I say, I don't care where you are on your spiritual path or what you're doing on your spiritual path, as long as you're on one. Because if you're always asking questions, if you're always thinking about it, be it a little or a lot, you're always making progress. And eventually you'll get to a point to where you're really aligned with the things that you're studying and believing. And that's really what you need to do, because it's the struggle that you have to go through to get to the point to where you understand different things about spiritual development or your consciousness development and maturity.
Plus, for me, I see development in general as, ups and downs, but overall, things are trending upward.
Correct.
And for me anyway, like, I don't know, about 10, 12 years ago, I felt like, I've got things really well figured out, and I could read a book and really feel like I understand it. And now I sort of feel like, wow, boy, I still have so much work to do. So I've gotten to a lower point where I realize what I don't understand, and then I'm sure there'll come a point where I'm like, yeah, okay, I think I figured it out, and then so it's a constant journey, eh?
Yeah. And I would also encourage people that are interested in talking or writing about their spiritual experiences and backgrounds to go ahead and do it, because you're going to have people that you will resonate with. It may not be everybody, but don't hold back with what you've experienced or what you want to write about, because it's always going to make a contribution somewhere with someone. And I think that's important. It's very easy to say that, oh, I learned about this, I've got to write about that or include that in what I've wanted to say, or I've got to look at this area or that area. You'll never get anything published. You'll never be able to speak about anything. So speak from where you are right now, and that will help take you as well as everybody else to a higher place.
Yes, that's a very good point, that your message, your personal message, not just you, Mark, but everybody here in attendance and those who watch this later, you have something to share with the world. And there are at least a few people who will benefit from that sharing. As in my image of it is, we're each helping each other to climb the ladder of understanding. And we're each helping each other up from one rung to another.
Right. And I would even say there's more than one lifetime worth of information to be assimilated. So, if you think about just the whole context of religion across the entire world, across all the different faith traditions, both East and West, for 2,000 years, 5,000 years, there's multiple lifetimes of information to assimilate and understand, to be able to, make your own determinations or interpretations of things. So I would say don't hold back.
Now, you mentioned mystical. Well, let's go back to Dark Night of the Soul. So here's another place where my understanding is a bit different, although I think I understand yours quite well. That's a great point that, and I've actually been at that point at times where I felt like, okay, I understand it. And when you do, it's kind of like, okay, is that all there is? It's just, it kind of, it's kind of like Einstein's equation equals mc squared. You take so many other branches of physics and so many other aspects, they've got walls full of equations to describe things. And then you get down to equals mc squared and you're kind of like, that's it?
Yeah.
That's the whole thing. So, but for me, that's not so much what I've generally associated, and probably many others would have this feeling that I do, that the dark night of the soul is when you have those moments where you felt like you had things figured out, and then you kind of revert to, no, I guess I really don't have things figured out. You may have felt on top of the world, like I was saying before, got it all going, and then a couple of things happen that are in your weak spot,
Mm-hmm.
and they throw you off your game, and you throw you off your bicycle, and suddenly you're lying by the side of the road in a heap, going, "Geez, I thought I was cruising."
That's right. Well, and I was going to say this definition of dark night of the soul came from Evelyn Underhill's book Mysticism. And before, and this is actually new material. If you see in the bottom left-hand corner, this is new stuff. If you look at this path here, this spiritual model, I had something else when I published the book in June of last year. I still had this Z, but it wasn't dark night of the soul. It was really being able to put yourself on the, if you think of an XYZ graph, and I'm going to get real technical, but you put yourself on the Z axis up above the X and Y, up above the world, detach yourself from the world and look down on it. And that helps you see that things are different from this earthly worldview. It still has the same focus to transform yourself from an earthly worldview to a spiritual worldview. But Evelyn Underhill said it much better than that. So that's what's going to be in my next book. This is a summary of the different things that she talked about in part 2 of her book. And I put it there, but like I said, I'll have that PDF and linked to the video when we put it up on YouTube.
Now, I would also say, I love the mystical union part, but it makes me think that there's another step that I would include here, which is what I'll call unity consciousness, or what's sometimes been termed cosmic consciousness. Or, I believe it's equivalent, at least in my mind, to what's been termed Christ consciousness. And just for those watching, I think the term Christ is very closely associated with Jesus, but it's a term. Jesus the Christ is the proper use of that term. Would you say a few words about unity consciousness, cosmic consciousness?
Well, I think it would fall in this mystical union section. It's actually a chapter in Underhill's book. So you're right on with that. If you're interested in my personal understanding of this, I think when you have mystical union, it's not necessarily a union with God. If you want to do the anthropomorphic God, it's more you're having a union with your higher level self. you've made the transition back through the higher level non-physical dimensions back to your higher level self, and you're actually having communion with yourself in the non-physical world. That's my picture of it, subject to change, but that's where I am right now.
For
and
me,
it's different from what people would say with a faith tradition background.
For me, it's oneness with all. So it would include everything. Oh, don't stop sharing your screen. We've got questions.
Okay, let's keep it
now
up
we've
there.
got some good questions in the chat here. And one of them goes to the complicated diagram. Go to that one for a moment, please.
Okay.
And these are not in the order that the questions have been raised, just so people know. I'm gonna skip around a little bit, but it says there's a ghost next to emotions and ego, and you can highlight that maybe with your cursor
Right here.
And can you talk more about this and how it affects the spiritual journey?
Just in a short sentence, I'll say spirits are real. The non-physical beings are real. Most people have said, evil spirits, demonic spirits, and stuff like that. But in my understanding and my personal experience, 95% plus have been benevolent or neutral in terms of the spirits that you meet. But one of the things that spirits do in your life is they'll insert these thoughts into your head to see how you're going to react. And I go back to a comment that Viktor Frankl made in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. It's a famous quote, but I think it's very important from a spiritual development standpoint. He said that you have no control over what the world hands you, and I'm paraphrasing, that you have total control over how you choose to respond to any given situation. And I think the way you choose to respond and how you change that response over time is a reflection of your spiritual maturity. And from the spiritual standpoint, the non-physical standpoint, spiritual beings will put thoughts in your head to say, hey, wouldn't this be cool? Or let's do this or let's do that, to see how you're going to react, because it's less invasive than doing something physically in your life, giving you a car accident or a serious illness or whatever. They'll give you thoughts to say, what's going on, or they'll build a scenario or a dream in your mind and say, well, here's this situation. This person's on the side of the road. Are you going to stop and help them out? Or are you going to go on? And it's really a test for you. So I look at evil spirits in air quotes as being temptation. When you realize that, you take on a different understanding of the thoughts that are going on in your head. And most of the thoughts that go on in your head are actually put there by spirits and not necessarily your own. It's when you start embellishing them and start building on them that's when your brain takes over, and that's when you need to raise a red flag to say, hey, I've got to watch this, especially if it's something that you shouldn't be doing, or you may not want to do. But that was the whole thing behind evil spirits, because I know a lot of people talk about that, but it's really just non-physical beings giving you temptations to see how you respond, and it's part of your spiritual development and maturity. Long answer.
So we learn in time how to handle those things. Yeah, that's a deep subject. We could go on. I'm going to not dig into it too far because that would take up the entirety of the rest of our time, I suspect.
Right.
Now, there's a question from Chantel relating to the prior conversation, the prior topic, about can the mystical union result in the higher self moving things in the real world? So I do believe personally, if I may take the first shot at this, that as we rise in spiritual awareness is the term I will use, that is mystical, metaphysical understandings, that we do, I believe, gain more ability to influence our reality. And I think that at the same time, when one is ignorant of a lot of the mystical, metaphysical principles, spiritual principles,
Mhm.
that I think that the universe is designed such that the feedback mechanism is modest, so that we don't totally mess ourselves up when we're confused, as most people are in this world. But as you become more and more understanding, the feedback mechanism opens up more,
Right.
and because you have less chance of hurting yourself,
Right.
so to speak, or
And
others.
and I'll say, for the people that are doing mediumship, healing, energy work right now, or who may have had, well, not necessarily the out of body experiences or near death experiences, but if you're doing mediumship healing or other energy work, you're getting a very low level of that energy, of that ability. And it may seem like a lot to you. You may be impressed by what you have, but really, on a scale of 1 to 10, I think it's probably like a 1 or a 2, because the spiritual beings that are out there guiding our spiritual development, they don't want us, like you were saying, Daniel, they don't want us to hurt ourselves or somebody else. But they do want us to get practice with it, because one of the components of these spiritual abilities is belief. And that's probably the hardest thing to learn. And it may take months or years to develop the belief, the unswerving belief that this thing is going to work. And that's what you actually need in order for a lot of these abilities to manifest themselves. Is you have to have that belief. You have to have focus, concentration, visualization, and have the intention for, the other person. And a lot of people like to say, for the highest and best for everyone involved. But belief is a critical component of it. And if you have everything else, but you don't believe it, or you even have an instant of not believing it, it's gone.
Yes, that's again another subject we could spend an
Another
entire
subject.
conversation on.
Yeah. And let me say, too, that Evelyn Underhill talks about these things in Visions and Voices and Ecstasy and Rapture. And introversion is just your response to starting to have these non-physical things happening to you. You become more introverted, or, more inner thinking as you start getting access to these higher levels of these abilities and these things that happen around you.
So I'm going to go now to a question from Anne A. Can people around you affect the level you're operating on? My mom seems to drop my vibes whenever I'm around her. She's always complaining and not thinking positively.
Yes. That's the short answer. Yes,
That's a
they
simple
can.
yes. Yeah.
Yes. But look at it as a challenge as to how can you keep your energy levels up, when you're in the presence of people who would want to drag them down. And that would be a nice challenge, I think, to help you with your own spiritual development.
Yeah, there's no doubt that, and I would say that we can look at those, as Mark was saying, in a sense, from Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. We can't control what happens, so we can't control the people and how they all behave, but we can control how we take that and what we do with it. And I have those challenges too. We all do. I don't have a mother who's a problem. Um, in some sense, my mother did me a blessing by leaving this world when I was young, and so I've been unencumbered by those close familial situations. And fortunately, as another aside, my wife's wonderful, but we still push each other's buttons a bit, and so I have to constantly catch myself, whatever it is, with any relationship, and say, okay, it's not about getting the outside world to conform to, make it easy on me. It's about me learning how to deal with all the turbulence and still be able to swim in that turbulent water, so to speak.
Right. And one other thing that's important, if you haven't heard this before, is that as you go through this process of spiritual development, of consciousness maturity, it won't take you somewhere where you're not. You're going to end up in the same place where you are right now. You're just going to have a different outlook on life and a different viewpoint for the world. So that's what this is going to do for you. It's not going to make you incredibly wealthy or do different things for you. It's just going to change your perspective. But it's actually, I think, the real purpose for our coming to Earth is to develop spiritually, to mature our consciousness. And that's our real goal. And the distractions are, material wealth, celebrity, power, and influence, all these other things that you see going on around us. But this is more the path that will benefit you in your eternal lifetime.
Excellent. Now, Nader has a point, and I'm saving Jim's question for the end because I think it's a good one to finish on so far. And again, we've had a few people join us late, so if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or we're going to open it up and you can actually ask Mark on camera, so to speak, or just by voice if you'd like. The next one we have from Nader is, how did Mark come to believe that there are actual spirits?
Because I can feel them. That's my secret sauce as I ask people, how did you come into this path, this spiritual path? And for the last 2 decades, I've been able to feel, hear, and even see spirits. So mostly at night, sometime in the day, but you can hear them all the time. And I've actually stuck my hand inside of spirits at night, and you could feel your hand tingle. So that's why in my bio, I say I've had these profound experiences that have changed the way I think. Spirits are real. This spiritual world is real. The non-physical dimensions are real. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing all this work and trying to help other people out. I hope that answered the question.
It felt pretty good to me, but we'll, the chat is open, so folks can ask some more. Well, is it a good time, I guess, to ask folks if they want to raise hands, or should we try and let's deal with Jim's question.
Okay.
And then we'll go for raising hands and asking questions directly. Jim says, how can we encourage people to want to explore their spiritual nature? What is the value proposition when there are so many earthly pressures people have to deal with every day? And I would start by saying, Jim, you can lead the horse to water.
Yeah, but you can't make it drink.
You can lead the people to spirituality, but you can't make them partake. Go ahead, Mark.
I remember some of these passages that I've read that say your life is really divided into 4 parts. The first part is just learning about life and getting your education. The second part, the second quarter, is building a family, having a job, doing the work in the world. And then the last half of your life is developing your spirituality. And I think that's why you see more older people in this area. There's more and more younger people coming out, I think, because they have more spiritual abilities at birth that they don't know how to use or what they are or what it all means, what the implication is. And for all these people, I'm hoping that this spiritual framework framework for spiritual understanding will give you a way to have those conversations, because someone who's in their 20s is not going to have the same alignment with this framework as someone in their 50s or 60s. And I'm hoping that that's what we can have in the conversation tonight, as well as going forward, is use this as the bridge to have those conversations, because a lot of people don't know right now. And I think it's important that we get that understanding so that we can unite. Especially in the spiritual world, people who are involved in the non-physical, metaphysical space, they're very decentralized, disorganized. There's a lot of very strong egos, I think, of people that are doing different things, but they really need to unify themselves And that's one thing I hope we can do through the Consciousness Cafe, but also I think each one of us individually can do to try and help bring some more attention and some more emphasis to this area of spirituality.
It's absolutely one of our fundamental mission points with Consciousness Cafe is to help raise awareness. I think it's clearly, for me, the reason why there's so many folks coming up with near-death experiences and reporting them. And so many of the folks who have those experiences, some of them, a good portion of them say that they were told they have work to do. And that a lot of them aren't sure what the work is, but some of them were told explicitly, go and let them know that there's a spiritual realm and physical reality isn't all there is, that there's more going on. And further, I think if you've set a goal, this world is very weird in that you come here and you forget everything. And then you try, as you said, to put all the pieces together without the picture for the puzzle that you're trying to assemble. And I would argue with the 1,000-piece part of that. I think it's more like a couple
10,
billion
000,
pieces.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think if you came with a goal of awakening and you're not on the right path, so to speak, the path of awakening, that's when things hit you from left field and they hit you hard. And it may not be that thing wouldn't have happened anyway, like say a loved one passing away, but it hits you different when you're not awake, when you're not realizing, okay, there's more to this world, there's more to reality, and okay, they're gone, but they're not gone forever. I'll see them again at some point. Some words on that, Mark?
Well, and I was going to say, I hope you can use this model to help give you some discernment over whether or not to attend a particular seminar or workshop. And I say a lot of the workshops and seminars that are out there, they teach you an earthly perspective of things. And if you're really wanting to advance spiritually, you need to go to workshops and seminars that talk about things from a spiritual perspective. If someone is going to give you a peak experience, but it's more of a temporal basis or an earthly nature, it's not going to help you on your spiritual walk. And I'm hoping this model can help you see that a little clearer, whether you use this model or create your own.
But it is very common that people don't ask these questions like, why am I here? What's it all about? Until they get whacked upside the head by some terrible event, whatever it might be.
Right. And from a spiritual perspective, what I've heard a lot of times is when you get whacked upside the head, it's because you haven't been listening to the more subtle messages that they've been giving you. So you can take that for what it's worth, but listen to these little subtle hints and subtle messages and act on them, because and also too, one benefit from quieting your mind is it will get you to a point to where you can start having that conversation with non-spiritual beings, with your higher level self. And that's when your spiritual development really takes off. It's because when you can have that conversation and that interaction, that's when things can really go much faster. And I think that's one of the hardest things for people to understand, is that they need to make that spiritual connection. And they get lost in, going to the beach, going out to the lake, picnicking, partying or whatever. But you need that spiritual connection to really develop spiritually.
And let me add that it does not matter. So this is a key part. It does not matter whether you call it talking to God, talking to Jesus, talking to Muhammad, your higher self. It does not matter what you call it, number one. Number two, when you have that conversation, you say, why did this happen? The first thing that comes to your mind, it's like instant, will be that spiritual inspiration if you're open to it.
Correct.
And the more you think about it, the more it's your mind and your ego and everything else getting involved in muddying the water.
Right. And I've even had intuitives tell me that when they have the foundational courses to teach people, intuition or mediumship, in the first week-long class, they spend half the week just convincing you that the things that you sense in your mind are real, and they have meaning instead of just these things that you dismiss. So don't dismiss things that pop into your mind.
Yeah, and some folks who are spiritually inclined, who've done a lot. One in particular comes to mind, Tom Campbell,
Yes.
who was involved with the Monroe Institute and has lots of videos on YouTube if you want to check those out. And he said it took him several years. He was having these out-of-body experiences with Monroe in the early days, and he still was like, I don't know, maybe, maybe not. And it wasn't until they had one particular set of experiences where he goes, okay, I believe now.
Yeah.
So here he was having out-of-body experiences, going into the spiritual realms, and still he was not sure if he was making it up.
There you go. Well, and that's the traditional engineer mindset. So, and I'll say too, I wrote my book for people with a science background, Earth's Hidden Reality, and I included an appendix where I try to, or I give you suggestions for experiments to disprove or falsify the major claims in the book, because I felt like people with a scientific background or who use the scientific method, they won't read my book. They'll just say, oh, this is some more metaphysical pseudoscience garbage and stuff. But if I give you a way to disprove what I claim, that will make people look. And for people who aren't familiar with the scientific method, what scientists use is whenever someone comes up with an idea or a hypothesis, they try to disprove it, and they won't believe it or even start to believe it until they can't disprove it. And that's the scientific method. That's the model. And I think it's a really strong model.
Yeah.
So when you hear skeptical scientists, don't get all upset or frustrated. They're just doing their thing because they're trying to find objective truth, and you can't find that very easily. It has to happen sometimes over years or decades.
And Tom, for example, says he wants you to be skeptical, but not, so skeptical that you're tossing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Well, Jim has been patiently waiting with his hand up, and anybody else who wishes to speak, please raise your hand, go to the reactions section at the bottom and raise your hand, and we'll recognize you in order. And I see Christian's up after Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to encourage people to speak up, raise your hand. We'd love to hear your comments. As you were talking, one of the thoughts that occurred to me is that one of the things we're trying to do in Consciousness Cafe is raise people's awareness of all these issues so that you can be emissaries. If you're comfortable talking about these things you've learned here, share them with other people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way to lead the horse to the water. Share your stories, share what you've learned here. Be confident that what we're talking about is supported by evidence. This isn't just all woo stuff. There's so much research, particularly in the IANS area, International Association for Near-Death Studies. You can't turn your back on the evidence.
Very well said. All right. Thank you for that. Next, we have Christian. You can just unmute yourself, or you can even get on camera if you'd like.
Hi, so my question was, what are your guys' thoughts on Michael Newton's book about the afterlife and authors like Dolores Cannon?
Very good.
I think Michael Newton's right on point. I have not had a life between lives experience, but I think what he's talking about certainly has a lot of credibility.
Yeah. Well, let me chime in. I love what Newton's doing and has done, and I support it completely. But I don't think it's the end result, or not the end result, the end of the line. There's so much more that we have to learn and discover. It's just the next step, if you will.
And it's just giving you that next layer of the onion, when you're ready to receive it, ready to understand it. Because what Newton has written is not for everybody. I think you have to be at a certain point in your spiritual maturity to be able to believe what he wrote and to actually assimilate it and understand it.
Do you want to say a little bit about some of what he said, Mark? I believe his book was Journey of Souls.
Journey of Souls. Yeah. No,
And
he wrote 3 books. He wrote one for psychologists on how to do life between lives regression, and then 2 that was soul related, but it was actually the life you lead or live between your lives on earth. And it involves studying and involves doing your spiritual contract for this next lifetime. It's a lot of work, but it makes sense. And another thing too that you need to think about is that in these different dimensions, time moves at a different rate. So what may be a 60, 70, or 80-year lifetime here on Earth may be 2 weeks, or even a couple days in different non-physical dimensions. So when they say you spend 1,000 years between your lifetime, on Earth, it may be, maybe a year or 2 years in that non-physical dimension, but down here on Earth, it would be 700 to 1,000 years. And I think that's just something to consider. And I talk about that in my book too, and how different dimensions, non-physical dimensions, have different densities. And the way you would move from one dimension to another, you have to actually do a different kind of shift than if you move from one reality to another within the same dimension. And you'll have to read my book it's another rabbit hole to go down into. But the way the offset for the different density, if you have a lighter density in these higher non-physical dimensions, is that time moves faster.
And I want to add personally, from my perspective, and as Mark said, we're all, I think, intended to develop our own perspectives. If life has taught me anything, it's that it values diversity. But from my perspective, you imagine a path of learning, of growth, and of expansion, and it's valid.
Right.
It doesn't have to follow anybody's methodology. It doesn't have to follow any particular thing. There are a few, rules of the game, as Tom Campbell would put it, depending on which game you're talking about. Right now, we're in the physical game, so we have to obey some of the physical rules, but there's still much more going on.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything?
And well, I was going to come back to say, I don't care where you are in your spiritual walk as long as you're on one, because you're eventually going to get to where you want to go. And your life experiences are going to give you different interests from Daniel or me or Jim or anybody else. And you should explore those and not be afraid to explore them, and not be afraid of the non-physical too. I think fear of the unknown is one of the things that the hindrances to exploring the non-physical. So you may have heard people say, is treat it like a child, is go in with this implicit understanding or trust that nothing bad's going to happen to you, and just explore the way a child explores and play with things and see what works and what doesn't.
Well, so a couple of words about that. We don't want to instill fear, but it's sort of like, to me, the analogy I use is like, in this world, there's some bad neighborhoods where you wouldn't go. Or if you went, you would go with a friend, or you'd be prepared for whatever you might encounter. And so I think it's important to understand that, yeah, there are some, just like in this world, there's some bad neighborhoods. You might encounter some people who are difficult, but you can call the spiritual police. You can call on God. You can call on whoever you believe in. It doesn't have to be God, for help. And you get that help when you call for it, in my experience.
Yeah. And another way to do that change too is to raise your frequency. Normally if you're at a lower frequency, you're going to be more likely to encounter some of these dark entities. But if you raise your frequency, or if you get in a position to where you feel, like there's some dark entities around you, focus on raising your frequency. And just like a tuner on an FM radio, you change the frequency, those guys are going to go away. Yeah. So that's one way out of it. And also too, it's respecting the life of those spiritual entities too, because they're on a spiritual walk as well. They're just at a different level from where you are.
Well, one more comment, and then we're going to go to Chantel. I know somebody who was harassed by negative spirits, and they harassed her horribly until she finally gave up. And when she gave up and acquiesced and thought she was going to die, was when the spiritual transformation occurred. And it was the resistance to them that was causing the problem, it seemed, or at least one part of it. Chantel, what have you got for us?
Hi, thank you so much for this. This is really great. This is my first time, so I'm really happy to be listening in. I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts if you're familiar with the changes that are going on in our solar system with our sun and the increased cosmic rays in our atmosphere and on Earth, and how that, your opinion, how that could be like affecting the consciousness of the planet, if you're familiar with that at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want
Mark?
to take it, Daniel, or
absolutely. So my sense of things is that, is it cosmic rays? I don't know what, but I do believe we are at an important inflection point in the advancement of this world, of this reality, of this dimension spiritually. And I also believe that everything is connected. And so what happens here with us affects the entire universe and beyond. And we're, some will say, on the leading edge. We're this world is one of the very few. There's only a couple, according to the material that I've studied extensively. There's only a couple that are as challenging and as important as this world. And it's why we come here, for the challenges that it presents. And while it can be a very difficult experience for some people, depending on your life path, it's making a tremendous difference. And I do believe there's a lot going on. And there's even this thing happening right now. We've just passed the spring equinox, or fall equinox if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think that's a significant, those things are significant to me, but we're also just passing into this thing called Heaven's Cross. Have you heard about this, Mark?
No, I was thinking about the moon passing in the Earth's magnetosphere with some other planetary alignments. People were talking on the internet that might be the occurrence or the prerequisites for some major earthquakes around the world. And I didn't know if that's what you were talking about, Chantel.
Actually, that it did happen. I think it's still kind of happening with like Jupiter and Saturn. But what I was more talking about is our sun goes through different cycles. I'm sure you guys know about the 11-year cycle. It also has a lot longer cycles of those 11-year cycles. And right now what it's doing is going through what they call grand solar minimum. And the shrinking of the heliosphere, which is like the sun's magnetosphere basically, allows cosmic rays to come into our solar system a lot more, because the sun used to funnel it just like our planet magnetosphere funnels the solar rays and stuff. And anyways, in studies they found as this level of cosmic rays changes, it affects our consciousness, behavioral health wise, and I just have theories it could affect other things as well.
I believe that's possible. Mark?
Yeah. Two things, and I hope I can remember them while I talk. The first is that we're eternal spiritual beings. So what we're experiencing here on Earth has happened, not even hundreds or thousands, but hundreds of thousands of times. This is not the first time that Earth has experienced this thing with the shrinking of the heliosphere or with the turmoil that's going on the planet. If you just trust that this is, what has to happen, you can have peace about it and not be anxious or depressed. And I think that's important. That's one thing. The other thing is the sun's alive. The sun is conscious. There's a conscious being encircling the Earth. It's a non-physical being. But if you read some of these materials about the formless dimension, they say we're actually beings of light. So all this light emanating from the sun, you could say that's conscious entities. Cosmic rays are conscious entities. But then again, everything that we see, feel, touch, sense on the planet is alive. It's all conscious. And I know it's a different way, it's a different perspective. You may not share it, but it gives you a sense of peace when you think about all the things that are going on. It's happened before. It's something that we all have to go through, but it's how we choose to respond to that that's going to make the difference. That's going to be the difference.
All right, I'm going to recognize, it says Scott.
Scott.
I'm going to put you on screen. Hello, Scott. You got to unmute. There you
Okay.
go.
I got a question about like spirits. If you contact spirits, will spirits tell you of much more clarity of their past lives that they've had?
Interesting question.
I'm not the right person to answer that question, because I know that it exists. I know that you can do it. But when I was writing my books, I learned just enough to know that it worked and that it was right, so I could write about it. But I didn't get into the details of it to understand a lot of the nuances of things. So when you read my book, it's very broad but very shallow. But I cover a lot of ground and try and link together things and systems. But what you're asking, Scott, I think is something more for a medium or for someone who does more telepathic communications to really give you a more definitive answer. And I think mediumship is actually interdimensional telepathy. If you wanted to look for a simpler explanation for it, when you say mediumship, that sounds kind of woo-woo, or it has different connotations to it. But if you say it's interdimensional telepathy, then that kind of puts it in a different realm, because parapsychologists have done a lot of experimentation on telepathy. For the last 100 years, they've done that. But I wouldn't be the right one to answer that question. But I think it's probably, well, shouldn't say I think. I don't know. Let me put it that way. I don't know. That's the engineering answer.
Does that answer your question, Scott?
Right. And there's another one that kind of goes along with it, and that is, I guess if somebody decides to reincarnate, then you really can't contact them at that moment, right? More or less, or?
I would disagree. So to your first part, I think everything is available in the Akashic records. There's this giant database in the sky that tracks everything. And it's been shown to my satisfaction by people who've had near-death experiences and the ability to interrogate them in various ways, not just through near-death experiences, but through mediumship and psychic abilities and things like that. So all of that's available. Number two, I'm going to say, I think we are all essentially, because all is one, we are all essentially incarnations of each other. Okay, that's my philosophy.
At some level.
So it's like fingers on the hand, but there's an infinite number of fingers, and we're all connected as you come back down the tree of all of that. And so I believe you can connect or contact any prior incarnation, because if you understand from many of these experiencers, they say time is not like we think it is. And they are able to see the past and the future and other lives happening at that same moment. So it's not like it's a past life or a future life. There are multiple simultaneous lives, is what I understand.
Yeah. And also, too, if you get into the nuts and bolts of reincarnation, there's some century-old Theosophical Society books that talk about the etheric body, the astral body, the mental body, and the causal body. And in there, they say that at some point, you drop your personality that you have here on Earth. Each personality that we have is something that our spiritual self, we have a spiritual personality, but our spiritual self adopts different personalities for those different lifetimes on Earth. So when we come into an incarnation on Earth, we have a personality, but when we die, that personality actually disappears as well. We have a spiritual self that's different from the personality self that we have here. And that you would get from these century-old books. I can only say from my reading it, that's what you have. But it's something to consider. And some people get really scared to say, I don't want to lose my personality after I die. You adopt that personality when you're incarnated, and I'll go back to what Daniel was saying too, is that if we're non-physical beings, you can come into any lifetime of any individual and adopt that personality and live that experience. And you may have different experiences for it, but you can come in at any point in that time stream. You don't have to incarnate serially. You can have 5 incarnations or a dozen incarnations in the same time period. You could be married to yourself, or your children could be yourself as well, but in a different incarnation, but with different personalities. So you'd never know it. Yeah, I know. Yeah, there you go.
Well, I'm going to take it a little different. So my beliefs are a bit different than Mark's. I think that the personality that is me or you, Scott, will go on and will continue on a spiritual path of its own. But it's like the fingers. So this finger is still a finger, but the experiences that it has and that all of them have get integrated into the higher self, the oversoul,
right.
And that then the oversoul has an oversoul. And so you can go to whatever level you want. You can go, you know what, I'm going to go down and visit the Daniel personality, or I'm going to go up and back down and visit the Scott personality, or, I'll go up 3 levels and I'll visit the oversoul of. So much more in this world than is dreamt of in our philosophies, as Shakespeare said.
Yeah. And just to tack on to that is, just like Daniel and I have disagreements on these things, it doesn't matter what we believe, it's what you believe, because it's your spiritual walk and your spiritual path. So I would encourage you to believe what you believe, and your beliefs will change as your spiritual maturity, your conscious maturity changes as well. So be open for that, but also that with that understanding, it makes you more compassionate and loving to other people who may treat you poorly because you just say they're spiritual beings on the same walk I'm on. They're just at a different point on their path.
And belief, as you pointed out before, Mark, belief is key. And belief, I think, creates our reality. So if I believe X, that becomes my view of the world, of the universe. And Mark's view will be his view until he changes it. And that's just amazing. It's so amazing. Good, Scott, or did you have more?
No, that was great. Thank you,
man. Thank you for the great question.
Yeah.
So we have another point in the chat from Nader. He says, I personally don't believe in spirits. That's good.
Yeah.
You can believe in what you want. I don't believe in spirits making themselves visible to me. I would have to see it to believe it for myself. Absolutely. But I do believe that we are all spirits that live on after this life. Yeah. And this does not mean that I don't believe Mark, that he sees spirits. His experience is different than mine. That's just what we were saying.
That's cool.
You do you, Mr. Nader.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad you're here. Glad you're contributing too.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I think all that is really loves is the variety. I call it infinite diversity and infinite combinations.
Yeah. And to bring it back to this presentation, I'm hoping that, by having this foundational groundwork laid, we can have conversations that we couldn't have otherwise, and talking about our different beliefs and how they're each okay, why one person would have more spiritual experiences than another one who might not, and just how that all balances out. I hope for everybody on the call that this presentation has been worthwhile to help you see that the spiritual path could actually be much bigger and broader than you might have previously understood. That's what my hope is, but I hope that you'll be able to take this and share it with other people and be able to have conversations you might not have had otherwise.
Exactly. Mark, I'm going to ask you to grab an image of your book to put up on the screen. And Christian has another question. Go ahead, Christian.
So I was curious about, because you listed numerous books, I was curious how each of them differ on the topic and what their approach to this study was. And I'm sorry if I asked anything that was already stated.
No. I think that each of the books provided different elements to Mark's work, and feel free to, he's going to bring up that slide. Go for it, Mark.
Right. This blue book is Earth's Hidden Reality. The red book, Christianity from a Spiritual Perspective, was my third book. This has some of the training wheel information in it. Earth's Hidden Reality has a lot more answers to things, a lot more systems and descriptions of things. The Critical Journey was that spiritual path. The Map of Consciousness was the scale. And then Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill provided that whole mysticism angle at the arrow point. But I'm going to put this bibliographic information in the PDF that is going to be tagged on the YouTube video of this conversation.
Very good. Anything else, Christian?
No, but thank you so much.
All right, you're welcome. Now, we've got a few advertisements to put into the conversation here. Number one, this is all brought to you by consciousness-cafe.com. And we invite you to come and join us over there and see the recordings, links to prior recordings, or to our YouTube channel, where you'll find this linked over there as well. And Jim's going to tell you, I think, about some upcoming events. Is that right, Jim?
Well, let Mark talk about the one on the 28th with Elizabeth Sabet. Mark, you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. On March 28th, Tuesday at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, 4 o'clock Pacific Time, Elizabeth Sabet's going to talk about how to recognize and support people who are going through spiritual emergencies. And I'm going to share, whoops, I'm sorry. Hold on. I'm going to share the screen from the Consciousness Cafe events page. She will talk about spiritual emergencies, how to recognize them, how to help people who are going through them. In my book, I encourage people to have a mentor for what you're doing, but have someone who's been on this path and has gone ahead of you, and don't try and strike out on your own and do things because you're going to end up somewhere where you don't want to be, or there's a good chance for it. But if you get in a situation to where, you know, you've overextended yourself, Elizabeth's going to talk about some things that will help you recognize that in other people and how to help them out. Elizabeth is a transformational coach. She's also studied with Dr. David Hawkins, so she could answer some questions on the Map of Consciousness if you wanted to ask her that next week. And she is a former president of the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, which is an organization that's an offshoot of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, but it was started by spiritual experiencers to give people a forum to talk about those things, but also to train spiritual directors and psychologists to help people who have had spiritual experiences but were either afraid or unwilling or unable to talk about them with their friends and family and community. So we really, really like Elizabeth. She's going to be a great speaker next Tuesday, and I hope you'll be there.
Absolutely.
And we have another event coming up on April 11th. I'm making a presentation on the subject of after-death communications. I've run into numerous people who've had these experiences. They generally don't share them with people. So I'm hoping that we can build an awareness that this is happening with some degree of regularity, and help people understand what things to look for when it's happening. I haven't set a date for this next subject, but I am leaving on the 14th of April to be in Togo for 2 weeks. My friend is going through a coronation to become a tribal king. It's not so much about him as it is to talk about the culture, that the reality that we experience is very heavily influenced by the culture you live in. And I've had a chance to see the culture in Togo, and I'll share some insights and experiences that maybe hopefully challenge our notions about how reality works.
And let me say that'll be a unique presentation too. It's not going to be some of these basic things on spiritual abilities. This will be a real unusual one, I think.
So there's a lot going on at consciousness-cafe.com. Please come over, join us, sign up, get on the mailing list, and you'll hear about all this great stuff going on. Also, please visit our friends at iands.org, iands.org, and especially go to their groups and events section where they have regular things. In fact, I'll be leading one. Just to place this in time, today is March 21st, 2023, if you're listening to this later on YouTube. And I've got something going on which will be live streamed and on YouTube as well for IANS, happening on March 25th. That's this Saturday at 1 o'clock. So any other advertisements?
I'd like to put a plug in for the annual IANS conference. It happens on Labor Day weekend. This year it's going to be in Alexandria, Virginia. I've been to 2 of these, and Daniel, I know, has been to a number of these conferences. It's a unique experience because you're among people who've had near-death experiences, and the energy that they carry with them, the feeling of being in a place of love, is not something you can experience just anywhere. So if you have any desire to well, here's a term, the benign virus. A researcher in near-death experiences talks about how when you get exposed to near-death experiences, you can actually, if you pay attention, you can acquire some of the benefits of a near-death experience without actually having to come close to death. So it's something for you to consider on your journey. Next fall, if you're so inclined, this is a great opportunity to raise your energy level.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Jim, how many people come to that conference each year?
Oh, Danny, you might know more.
Yeah.
I know several hundred, but
Yeah. Well, in 2019 we had 400 or so, and that in some respects may seem like a lot, in some respects may not seem like a lot, but it's a perfect size in my opinion. The next 2 years, 2020, 2021, we did virtually. And then this past year, this past September 2022, we were in Salt Lake City. Saw Jim out there, and it was a great group. And I think we were close to 400 again there.
Yeah.
So.
And a lot of experiencer forums as well, right?
Oh, well, there's tons going on. So visit conference.iands.org, and you'll see the coming soon information there. A few of the headliners are listed. They're just finalizing who's going to be the speakers for this coming Labor Day weekend, starting late August into the early September is always when the conference is. And this year it's going to be, does anybody know? No, you don't remember where it's going to be?
Oh, Alexandria.
Yeah, it's going to be just outside Washington, D.C. So for folks on the East Coast, this is your year. It's not too far. You can make hotel reservations now.
And if you're a healer, I know in past years they've had healing workshops where people donate their time. They set a room aside. It's a great opportunity to practice your skills, to be a benefit to someone.
Yeah. Lots of great stuff happening with the conference, including workshops and lots of speakers, a lot of keynotes, a couple of film premieres, all kinds of fun. So
yeah, a lot of the stuff is between the just meeting people, going out to dinner with somebody that you've never known, but it's like you've had this relationship all your life with a person.
So here's a great anecdote. Speaking of which, there's a gentleman who some of you have probably seen if you watch some of the NDE documentaries and things. And his name is David Bennett. And so David and I were working on various things, and I've known him for a while, but I didn't know that much about him just because we went out to lunch and I learned a number of interesting tidbits from David. Some of you may have seen him on the documentary with Morgan Freeman. and I forget what the name of that series was. It was a series. It was about spirituality in general, and there was one episode on near-death experiences. But he told me that in his near-death experience, in David's near-death experience, he saw that he was going to be on TV with a Black person. And he thought all along, he thought it was going to be Oprah. And then things just lined up and it was Morgan Freeman. So you learn fun tidbits like that at the conference. Anything else, gentlemen? All right.
It was good.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Absolutely. Great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mark and Daniel, for doing this.
Spread the word. Be a light unto the world.